Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world.
It is so great to be here for this one.
Yeah, I'm really excited. Today, we're embarking on a pretty profound mission, and we are just so glad you're here with us to explore it.
Absolutely. You, the listener, you're basically the third person in this conversation today.
Right. And our goal today is to hand you a specific lens, like a set of analytical tools to help you see the hidden architecture operating quietly beneath all the noise of our daily news feeds.
Because there is a lot of noise out there right now.
Oh, constantly. So we've got this fascinating, really dense stack of source material today. It's centered heavily on the structural analysis found in Wendy Brown's work, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, the Rise of Antidemocratic Politics in the West.
It's a brilliant text, and we're using it to investigate this massive systemic paradox that completely defines the world you and I live in right now. Yeah, the mission of this deep dive is to figure this out. For decades, neoliberalism promised ultimate human freedom through the expansion of free markets. It was supposed to be this ultimate liberating force, right? Unleashing human potential from the heavy hand of the state.
That was the pitch, yeah.
So why did this exact system help produce a contemporary political landscape across the West that increasingly rejects the very concept of democracy itself?
I mean, it is arguably the defining paradox of our era. We're looking at a system built explicitly on the promise of individual liberty, which has somehow birthed this era of intense authoritarian demand, extreme polarization, and just a fundamental rejection of democratic equality.
Yeah. But before we jump into the deep end, I really want to make something explicitly clear to you, our listener.
This is an important caveat.
Very important. The sources we are unpacking today contain highly politically charged concepts. We are going to be talking about the structural mechanics behind both left-wing and right-wing movements. We'll be touching on culture wars, massive legal battles, and, the political rhetoric you see on your screens every single day.
But we want to emphasize this heavily. We are taking no sides here.
None at all.
Right.
We're making no moral judgments about these movements. We are not evaluating the ethics of these political shifts. And we are certainly offering no political prescriptions.
No advice on how you should vote or how you should feel.
Exactly. We are strictly here to impartially report on the structural institutional analysis contained in the original material. Our only goal is to help you see the architecture of the system, how it's designed, what behaviors it mathematically incentivizes, and what outcomes it predictably produces.
Just mapping the machinery.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this.
What's fascinating here is that to understand this architecture, we first have to completely redefine the word neoliberalism itself.
Because it's a loaded word.
Totally loaded. When you hear that word, if you follow politics or history, you probably immediately think of economic policies, right?
Yeah, I think of the late 70s and 80s.
Exactly. You think of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, or the Chicago School of Economics. You think of deregulation, sweeping tax cuts, busting labor unions, or shifting manufacturing jobs overseas.
Just purely economic stuff.
Right. But Wendy Brown's source material, drawing heavily on the theories of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, argues that viewing neoliberalism merely as an economic policy is a fundamental misinterpretation.
So what is it then?
Well, according to this analysis, it is actually what Foucault called a political rationality.
Let's pause on that term, because political rationality sounds, quite academic. How is a political rationality fundamentally different from just a standard political ideology?
That's a great distinction to make.
Because we have conservatism, liberalism, socialism. Is this just another ideology we vote on?
It is much deeper than an ideology. An ideology is a set of beliefs you might hold about how the government should be run. A political rationality, in Foucault's framework, is more like the underlying operating system of a society.
An operating system.
Yeah. It's a world-making rationality that literally reformats what counts as legitimate reasoning across every single sphere of human existence. It dictates not just what we think about, but how we think.
Okay, that's huge.
It really is. To understand the shift, the text contrasts it with classical liberalism. So in classical liberalism, going back to thinkers like John Locke, humans were understood as having multiple dimensions.
Like we weren't just one thing.
Right. We were homo juridicus subjects of the law with inherent rights, and we were subjects of exchange, meaning we had needs and we traded to satisfy them.
But neoliberal rationality changes that.
It collapses all of those dimensions. It transforms humans into something else entirely homo economicus, but not just as traders. It redefines us as subjects of relentless competition and human capital enhancement.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, It takes the logic of the market concepts like competition, investment, yield, risk management, and performance metrics, and it applies it to spaces that have literally nothing to do with the economy.
Precisely. It applies market logic to the state, to democratic institutions, to public schools, hospitals, exactly. And ultimately, to you and me in our private lives. Under this rationality, the text argues, you stop being viewed by the system as a citizen participating in a shared civic project.
What do you become instead?
You become a localized portfolio of human capital.
Wow.
Your life is just a continuous project of self-management, where you must constantly optimize your value and protect yourself against risks.
That shifts the ground beneath our feet completely. It means market principles aren't just contained to the stock exchange or the grocery store anymore.
No, they become the saturating reality principles for everything.
It completely explains why we talk about investing in relationship, or managing our personal brand on dating apps.
Yes.
Or why education is no longer discussed as the pursuit of knowledge for a healthy democracy, but strictly as a calculation of return on investment for future earnings.
That is the exact infiltration the text is pointing out. And this brings us to a massively important pivot point in Brown's analysis. She utilizes perhaps one of the most famous quotes of the late 20th century.
I know exactly which one you're talking about.
In 1987, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher declared, "There is no such thing as society. There are individual men and women, and there are families."
I remember reading that quote in the sources, and it is startling when you look at it not as a passing political slogan, but as an architectural blueprint.
Yes, as a foundation for a system.
So what does it actually mean structurally to design a system based on the premise that the social does not exist?
It is a devastatingly effective structural maneuver. If you establish as a baseline truth of governance that society is a myth, you systematically hollow out the entire concept of the social domain.
And what goes away when you hollow that out?
Well, according to Brown's analysis, the social domain is precisely where systemic power operates. It's the conceptual container where class hierarchies, racial disparities, gender dynamics, and historical legacies of exclusion actually live, and where they can be measured.
Right. So if society doesn't
But
exist,
systemic social power cannot exist.
and if systemic social power doesn't exist, then any claim a citizen makes about systemic injustice is fundamentally illogical within that system.
Exactly. It just doesn't compute in the operating system.
Let's trace how that impacts the listener. Let's say someone is struggling to pay off crippling student loan debt,
Right.
or they are facing generational poverty,
Yeah.
or they encounter algorithmic discrimination in the housing market.
Mm.
This systemic logic dictates that this cannot be a societal failure that we must solve together through democratic means.
Correct. Because under a neoliberal rationality, there is no we to solve it. This logic shifts the burden of all systemic risk entirely onto you, the individual.
It's all my fault.
That's what the system's reasoning dictates. If you are struggling, you simply made a bad investment in your human capital. You failed to optimize yourself. You took on the wrong risk.
And what are the political consequences of that shift? Like, if all outcomes are redefined as just the natural result of individual market competition, how does the system view government intervention?
It completely reframes the moral valence of the state.
How so?
If inequality is just the natural sorting mechanism of the market, rewarding good human capital and punishing bad human capital, then any attempt by the democratic state to intervene becomes illegitimate.
So if the government tries to create social justice,
Or enforce civil rights, or level the playing field, or heavily tax the wealthy to provide public goods, it is no longer seen as the democratic pursuit of equality.
what is it seen as?
Brown argues the system casts this intervention as a tyrannical, coercive overreach. Yes. The state is viewed as artificially interfering with the natural, spontaneous order of things. Thus, the very definition of freedom is explicitly pitted against the concept of social justice.
Which sets up the next major structural change discussed in the text, which is the dethroning of politics itself.
Yes, the hollowing out of the political sphere.
Because if society is a myth, and any attempt to manage social equality is viewed as tyranny, what is the government even supposed to do? Why do we have politicians at all?
In this framework, the architecture of government is structurally redesigned to be purely managerial.
Managerial, like corporation.
Exactly. The classical idea that politics is a vital, noisy, deliberative space where citizens come together to debate and pursue a common good that's stripped away. The political sphere is recast by neoliberal thinkers as inherently coercive, unruly, inefficient, and constantly corrupted by arbitrary special interests demanding resources.
And the sources point specifically to Friedrich Hayek here, right?
They do.
One of the foundational architects of neoliberal thought. How does his theory fit into this managerial shift?
Hayek is crucial here. To understand Hayek, the text notes we have to remember he was writing in the mid-20th century. He was deeply traumatized by the rise of totalitarianism, specifically Stalinism and Nazism.
Right, he saw what centralized power could do.
Yes. He believed that any centralized state planning inevitably leads down the road to serfdom. Therefore, he framed markets and, importantly, traditional morality as spontaneous orders.
Spontaneous orders, meaning they just happen naturally.
He argued they are organic, natural, and evolve peacefully through the decentralized choices of millions of individuals over time.
Without the government telling them what to do.
Exactly. Because of this, Hayek argued that governance should be reduced to a market-like optimization process. The state's job is not to secure the good life for its citizens or to engineer equality.
What is it?
The state's only legitimate function is to facilitate, build, protect, and occasionally rescue markets.
So it essentially turns politicians into the middle management of a giant economic zone, where you and I, the citizens, are just consumers or competing shareholders.
That's exactly how the architecture sees us.
But Hayek didn't just stop at markets, did he? The text highlights his concept of the personal protected sphere, which seems to be the absolute key to understanding the culture wars we see escalating today.
Yes, the personal protected sphere is the legal and cultural fortress of this rationality. Hayek argued that for spontaneous order to function, individuals, private property, and traditional families must be insulated from the reach of democratic majorities.
Insulated from the majority.
Right. The text meticulously details how this system builds legal mechanisms to expand what counts as private. It elevates the right to exclude the right to keep others out of your business, your neighborhood, or your institutions as a fundamental, untouchable civil liberty.
I really want to make sure I grasp the gravity of this, because it's not just about keeping the government from taking your money through taxes. Brown is arguing that this architecture gives traditional morality and private market power the structural authority to override secular, democratically enacted laws.
That is exactly the argument.
That's wild.
It is. When you eliminate the concept of the social and you demote democratic politics to mere economic management, the only legitimate forces left to organize human behavior are markets on one side and traditional morality on the other.
And both are seen as natural.
Both are elevated as natural and spontaneous. Thus, they're granted a sort of supreme, almost divine authority over deliberate, democratically enacted laws.
So if a Democratic majority votes for inclusive policies, say, civil rights integrations or broad anti-discrimination laws.
This expanded personal protected sphere allows traditional morals to push back. It successfully frames the democratic law as the actual oppressor.
Okay, this makes me want to look really closely at the incentive structure here, because systems are ultimately defined by what they reward and what they punish. If we're living in an architecture that forces everything to act like a market, what does this system actually reward on an institutional level?
The incentive architecture is ruthlessly clear once you map it out. Institutions, whether we're talking about public universities, national parks, the postal service, or healthcare systems, are incentivized strictly for market conformity.
Market conformity, so acting like businesses.
They are rewarded for privatization, for deregulation, and for implementing measurable corporate performance metrics.
So what happens if they can't do that?
If a public institution cannot prove its value through economic metrics, cost-benefit analyses, or direct yield on investment, it is starved of resources, it's labeled inefficient, or it's just privatized entirely. The reward goes only to those who can successfully economize their function.
And how do political actors navigate this landscape?
Yeah.
Because politicians are still out there campaigning. They're still trying to win elections. But if they can't promise to improve society because society supposedly doesn't exist and the state is just a managerial facilitator, what do they actually campaign on?
They adapt to the incentives. Brown notes that politicians gain immense structural advantages by converting what used to be complex democratic conflicts over the distribution of resources into pure culture war moralism.
Pure culture war.
Think about it logically. They can no longer argue about securing the public good because the system has intellectually delegitimized the concept of a public good, so instead, they act as political entrepreneurs.
Finding a new market to exploit.
Exactly. They replace complex policy debates with absolutist claims about freedom. They mobilize populations not around shared democratic futures or infrastructure, but around protecting their personal protected spheres from the encroaching coercive state, or from perceived outsiders who threaten their traditional norms.
And the modern media ecosystem fits into this architecture like a key into a lock. The platforms you and I use every day to consume information, they have their own algorithmic incentive structures that align seamlessly with this neoliberal rationality.
Oh, perfectly. The text highlights how media platforms are rewarded through engagement metrics, clicks, and ad revenue for amplifying grievance.
Because nuance doesn't sell.
Complex structural causes are terrible for engagement.
Right. It is incredibly difficult to make a viral post explaining the multi-decade deindustrialization of a specific region, or the intricate financialization of the housing market, or global supply chains.
It takes too long to read.
So the platforms and the political entrepreneurs simplify those dense systemic issues into easily digestible, identity-based enemies.
Which is a brilliant, if destructive, systemic adaptation. It is so much more efficient from a market metric perspective to direct a citizen's precarious economic anxiety toward an immigrant, a marginalized group, or a woke elite than it is to critique the global trade policies that actually caused the precarity.
It's a misdirection.
That simplification is a feature of the system, not a bug. It successfully directs the anxiety generated by the market away from the market itself and channels it entirely into cultural and nationalistic animosity.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. We've talked about politicians and the media, which are very visible to the listener. But Brown's text points to a much quieter, yet immensely powerful institutional pathway where this battle is being fought and codified, and that is the court system, the weaponization of jurisprudence.
This is a critical structural layer of the book, and it requires us to look at how legal doctrine physically mutates under this rationality.
The courts aren't immune to this operating system.
Not at all. The text details how the court system, particularly the United States Supreme Court, is actively utilized to protect this new architecture.
What's the mechanism there?
A prime example explored in the source material is the long-term legal strategy employed by groups like the Alliance to Defending Freedom, or the ADF. Brown analyzes how their legal strategy relies on an incentive structure within the courts that increasingly prioritizes what is called private ordering.
Private ordering. That sounds like Hayek's personal protected sphere.
It's exactly that. It's the right of individuals and businesses to set their own rules based on markets and morals, and the courts prioritize this over public inclusion and democratic equality.
The sources spent a lot of time on very specific, high-profile Supreme Court cases that listeners have likely seen in the headlines, like Masterpiece Cake Shop, involving the baker who refused to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple.
Yes.
And Nifalavi Becerra, involving crisis pregnancy centers challenging laws that required them to post public health notices.
Those are the key examples she uses.
And the text argues these aren't just quirky local disputes about cakes or bulletin boards. They are the front line of a massive structural shift in how rights are understood. Can we break down the mechanics of that shift?
Absolutely. To understand the shift, we have to look at the history of rights discourse. Historically, especially in the mid-20th century during the Civil Rights Movement, First Amendment rights and equality doctrines were largely used to integrate marginalized groups into the public sphere.
They were used to open doors.
Rights were a tool to force the public accommodation of all citizens, to dismantle segregation, and to ensure equal participation.
But Brown argues that under neoliberal jurisprudence, the mechanism of the First Amendment is essentially flipped.
Completely inverted. Liberties, specifically free speech, and the free exercise of religion are stretched far beyond their classical civic meaning.
The text notes that these rights are extended to cover businesses and corporations, treating commercial entities as if they have deeply held personal beliefs and speech rights.
Yes. And by doing so, the courts facilitate a profound alchemy. Religious liberty is converted from a private right, your freedom to worship as you choose in your private life without state interference, into a public weapon.
A weapon.
It empowers capital and religionists to push back against civil rights, anti-discrimination laws, and the regulatory state.
So in the Masterpiece Cake Shop example, if a Democratic legislature passes a law saying a business must serve the public equally, the business can now use the First Amendment as a shield. They can claim the law infringes on their compelled speech or religious exercise.
Exactly. The court incentivizes the protection of the private sphere's right to exclude, heavily weighting it over the public sphere's democratic mandate to include.
So what does this all mean?
For democracy.
Yeah. When you take all these architectural pieces we've laid out, the deletion of society, the dethroning of politics into management, the privatization of everything, the media grievance loops, and the weaponization of the courts, what is the predictable fallout for our political landscape?
The predictable structural outcome, according to Brown, is the severe weakening and perhaps the total collapse of democratic equality.
And the total collapse.
When economic rationality becomes the absolute default language of governance, formal legal equality might still technically remain on the books. We still have the right to vote,
Sure.
but social equality is completely delegitimized. If the only true metric of human value is market success, and the only true freedom is the right to be left alone in your protected sphere to exclude others, then the very concept of a shared fate among citizens disintegrates.
There is no foundation left for democracy to stand on.
None.
And Brown's text makes a striking point here. This architecture doesn't just result in a quiet, hyper-capitalist utopia where everyone just trades peacefully. The outcome is highly volatile.
Very volatile.
The text describes a fusion of different political forces that one might assume would contradict each other. We are seeing the blending of hardline libertarian anti-state rhetoric with fierce traditional moralism and a very potent strain of white resentment and grievance politics.
That volatile fusion is arguably the great unintended consequence of the neoliberal design. The original architects of this system, thinkers like Hayek and the Chicago School, believed that by submitting politics to the cold, rational, calculating logic of the market, they would pacify the masses.
They thought money would calm everyone down.
They thought they could drain the dangerous ideological passions out of political life.
But they were wrong.
The text argues they fundamentally misunderstood human nature and the sociological effects of their own policies. By stripping away the social safety net, destroying the concept of shared public goods, and exposing everyone to the brutal, unshielded risks of the global market, neoliberalism accidentally inflamed the very politicized mass effect it was trying to pacify.
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox. Brown's analysis suggests that if you leave people entirely exposed to the elements of global capital, tell them that any failure is their own personal moral failing regarding their human capital, and delete the language of structural class critique.
The pain doesn't just go away.
Right. The resulting pain and anxiety doesn't just disappear. It has nowhere to go except into identity, nationalism, and traditionalism.
Which leads directly to a terrifying mutation of the concept of freedom itself.
How so?
Well, in a robust, functioning democracy, freedom is inextricably tied to participation. It is the freedom to have a voice in the laws that govern you, to deliberate with your fellow citizens, and to shape the society you live in.
Freedom to act together.
But in this new anti-democratic architecture, the text argues that freedom is redefined almost entirely as the right to exclude. It is the right to keep your money untaxed, the right to keep your business segregated from norms you disagree with, the right to keep your neighborhood walled off.
It is freedom from democracy rather than freedom through democracy.
Exactly.
And the concept of speech mutates right along with it. Free speech used to be championed as a necessary civic tool for democratic deliberation. We exchange ideas to find the truth, debate policy, and govern ourselves.
That was the ideal.
But Brown argues that speech has been transformed into a weaponized shield for domination. It becomes the absolute right to say whatever you want, no matter how vitriolic or harmful, without any accountability to the social fabric.
Because, again, under this rationality, the social fabric does not exist.
Right, it doesn't exist, so you owe it nothing.
This brings us to one of the most glaring paradoxes in the entire structural analysis. Neoliberalism constantly preaches the shrinking of the state. Its rhetoric constantly warns against government tyranny and bureaucratic overreach.
Small government, that's the mantra.
Yet, the predictable outcome we are living through across the West is not a shrinking state at all. The state remains massive, heavily funded, and incredibly powerful.
That's a crucial point to clarify for the listener. The government didn't pack up and go home.
It absolutely did not. Instead, the nature of its power simply shifted to align with the new rationality. The text points out that the state is increasingly instrumentalized by big capital.
captured by it.
Yes. Major industries like agriculture, oil, pharmaceuticals, tech monopolies, and finance have their hands firmly on the legislative wheels. They utilize state power to secure their markets, enforce their patents, and socialize their losses during crises.
We had the bailouts.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, the citizenry, stripped of democratic power and facing intense economic precarity, is exposed to demagogic nationalism. The state becomes a dual-purpose tool. It is a facilitator for protecting global capital and simultaneously a heavily militarized policing force to manage the domestic fallout.
It essentially gives up the role of democratic caretaker and becomes a combination of a corporate board of directors and a heavily armed security guard.
That is a perfect way to summarize it.
And what makes this analysis so deeply compelling is that this architecture doesn't just happen once and fade away. It is sustained by incredibly powerful feedback loops.
The architecture of persistence.
Yes, the persistence in this system is fascinating. Let's walk through these loops step by step, because this is how the system entrenches itself so deeply that it feels completely invisible to us.
The feedback loops are the engine of this system. The first loop centers on the deliberate erosion of the public sphere. It starts with the premise we discussed, economized governance.
Making the government run like a business.
The state is forced to act like a business, focusing on austerity, cutting taxes, and reducing public spending to prove its efficiency.
And what does that do?
This naturally leads to a shrinking of public capacity. The state literally becomes less capable of providing decent schools, maintaining infrastructure, running efficient transit, or offering functional social services.
And because the public services are now systematically underfunded and failing, the public understandably loses faith in them.
Right.
Which perfectly justifies the next step in the loop.
Precisely. The visible failure of the starved public sector is used as empirical evidence that the government is inherently inept. This forces more privatization. People who can afford it turn to private schools, private security, private healthcare, and private transportation.
You just buy their way out.
And this massive withdrawal of resources and participation into the private sector causes a further deeper erosion of the social fabric.
Because we stop mixing with each other.
Exactly. The less we share public goods, the less we interact with people outside our demographic, and the less we feel any sense of shared destiny or common citizenship, which of course justifies more austerity and more privatization, and the loop continues, hollowing out the foundation of democracy from the inside.
Now let's look at the second feedback loop, which Brown uses to directly tackle the anger and the authoritarian surge we are witnessing. To understand this loop, the text asks us to think back to the 2008 financial crisis.
That was a massive inflection point.
The catastrophic loss of pensions, the evaporation of stable, unionized manufacturing jobs, and the gigification of the economy. The risk was shifted entirely onto the working and middle classes, while the massive financial institutions were bailed out by the state.
This systemic risk shifting creates intense, widespread precarity, and precarity breeds fear. But the source material, drawing deeply on the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, asks us to look at a very specific type of reaction to this precarity, what Nietzsche called ressentiment.
Let's define that carefully, because ressentiment is a very specific philosophical concept, not just a fancy French word for anger.
Correct. Nietzsche differentiates between active, righteous anger, like the anger of the oppressed demanding equality, and resentment.
How does he define ressentiment?
Resentment is a toxic reactive rage that stems from perceived humiliation, weakness, and an inability to act. It is the simmering bitterness of feeling powerless, which then manifests as a desire to punish others rather than uplift oneself.
It's a vindictive kind of anger.
Yes. And the text specifically links this concept of ressentiment to the contemporary political phenomenon of dethroned white maleness.
I want to pause there and tread carefully to ensure we are looking at this structurally exactly as the text does, rather than making moral judgments about individuals.
That's vital.
When Brown talks about dethroned white maleness, how does she define it within this neoliberal architecture?
She maps it as the loss of a historical, psychological, and economic wage. For decades, whiteness and masculinity provided a sort of structural buffer against the harshest, most brutal edges of capitalism. There was an assumed hierarchy.
But that buffer eroded.
Yes, as neoliberal policies devastated the middle and working classes, universally sending jobs overseas, crushing unions, financializing housing, that buffer eroded. The ensuing pain and economic displacement is profound and very real.
But here is where the neoliberal rationality traps them. Because the system has deleted the language of structural economic critique and replaced it with individual human capital metrics, this group cannot logically target the massive economic systems that actually dispossess them.
Because targeting the system would require admitting that society and systemic power actually exists, which their political rationality explicitly denies.
Right. It creates a cognitive trap.
Exactly. So this unstaunched wound of lost dominance, this profound humiliation of downward mobility, generates an intense demand for authoritarian order and a return to traditional hierarchy. They want a strong man to come in and restore their status, to punish the people they feel have illegitimately leapfrogged them, whether that's immigrants, minorities, or cosmopolitan elites.
And that exact demand for a strongman, for a return to a mythical past hierarchy, is what fuels and intensifies anti-democratic nationalist politics. The system creates the economic precarity. The precarity creates the wound of resentment. The rationality blocks a systemic cure, and so the wound demands an authoritarian bandage.
Which ties directly into the third feedback loop, the legal one we touched on earlier regarding the ADF and the courts.
How does that loop function?
Well, as this aggrieved population seeks to protect its remaining status and traditional norms from a changing world, it utilizes the courts. We see the expansion of religious liberty and absolutized free speech protections used specifically to bypass inclusive democratic laws.
As you mentioned earlier, the right to not bake the cake, the right to not recognize the same-sex marriage, the right of the private sphere to exclude the public mandate.
Yes, and the loop functions like this. As this privatized exclusion becomes legally normalized by the Supreme Court and culturally accepted, it structurally weakens the very concept of democratic inclusion.
It makes exclusion the law of the land.
The more exclusion is protected as a fundamental constitutional freedom, the more it legitimates the broader anti-democratic nationalist movements that argue the nation itself should have the freedom to exclude. The private right to discriminate scales up seamlessly into a national political platform of closed borders and cultural purity.
To make this abstract architecture incredibly concrete for the listener, Brown's text uses a brilliant, visceral analogy about the feudalization of everyday life.
I love this analogy.
It's so good. She asks the reader to think about the physical experience of modern travel. Think about the last time you went to the airport and boarded an airplane.
It is the perfect physical microcosm of the neoliberal soul.
It really is. Let's walk through it. You get to the gate, and the boarding process is hyper-stratified. You have boarding group 1. These are the people who have paid a premium or have elite credit card status to buy their way out of the crowding, the waiting, and the anxiety.
They get to bypass the stress.
Yes. They board first, settling into spacious seats, handed a pre-flight drink, exuding this aura of cosmopolitan importance and ease. And then you have boarding group 5.
The rest of us.
The rest of us. These people are smashed together in the terminal, anxious about overhead bin space, waiting endlessly for their zone to be called, experiencing the friction, the indignity, and the stress of the crowd.
And what the text argues so powerfully is that this tiered pricing of everyday existence habituates us to deep structural inequality. And we see this everywhere now, not just at the airport.
Where else?
We see it in express lanes on public highways, premium tiers for basic software, VIP access at hospitals, and concierge public services. This environment teaches us, on a bodily psychological level, that humans do not have equal worth.
That's bleak.
Your worth, your comfort, your access to basic dignity, and your time are strictly mathematically tied to your market value.
It makes our subjectivity, our very sense of who we are in relation to others, more feudal than democratic. We begin to accept lords and peasants as a natural, unavoidable law of the marketplace.
Yes, it just feels like the natural order.
And if you are in boarding group 5, watching boarding group 1 breeze past you while you sweat about your carry-on, it absolutely intensifies that Nietzschean resentment we just talked about.
It fuels the fire.
But notice what happens. You rarely direct your anger at the airline corporation for shrinking the seats, charging for bags, and creating the artificial scarcity in the first place. Instead, you direct your anger at the people walking past you, or the people in your own group who are taking up too much space.
The system pits the subjects against each other, while the architecture remains completely invisible.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this micro-level feudalization at the airport mirrors massive, nested historical structures.
Brown insists we cannot view this neoliberal rationality in a vacuum. It is deeply entangled with macroeconomic shifts. We have touched on deindustrialization, but we must also acknowledge the hyperfinancialization of the global economy.
Where making money off of money became more profitable than actually manufacturing goods or employing people.
Exactly. Furthermore, the text notes that this rationality intersects heavily with the reproduction of racial hierarchies, what Brown refers to as the imperial colonial imaginary.
Let's define that for the listener, because imperial colonial imaginary is a dense academic phrase. What exactly does that mean in the context of domestic policy and this new rationality?
It refers to the unspoken historical hierarchy of Western dominance. The idea that certain groups, historically white, Western male, are naturally entitled to rule, to own, and to expand, while others are meant to be subject or excluded.
And how does that survive today?
Brown argues that the explicit legal hierarchies that were formally dismantled by the civil rights movements in the 1960s didn't just vanish. Instead, they are quietly reproduced and protected under the new, seemingly neutral guise of market freedoms, the right to private association, and the protection of traditional morality. The psychological map of who belongs on top persists through these structural loopholes.
And as this happens, the very concept of the nation is reimagined by the public. We stop talking about the nation as a democratic republic of equal citizens bound by a constitution and shared fate.
It becomes something else entirely.
Instead, the political rhetoric we hear today oscillates wildly between two new metaphors. Sometimes the nation is talked about as a competitive firm, America Inc.,
Right.
that just needs a ruthless CEO to make better trade deals, optimize the supply chain, and crush international competitors. And other times, it is talked about as an endangered private family household that needs to lock its doors and build walls against intruders.
And Brown's text points out a crucial structural reality about both of those metaphors. Both the firm and the traditional family are inherently undemocratic.
They aren't democracies at all.
A corporation is not a democracy. It is a strict hierarchy, a dictatorship of the shareholders and the CEO. A traditional patriarchal family is a hierarchy based on authority, not a democratic assembly of equals.
And this reimagining of the nation necessitates a massive expansion of securitization.
Security becomes everything.
If the nation is just a collection of private spheres, owned properties, and traditional families, you need massive walls, gated communities, and an ever-expanding securitarian state.
You need more militarized police, vast border patrols, and intense surveillance to protect the owned from the common, to protect the deserving insiders from the undeserving outsiders.
Which fundamentally relies on a phenomenon the text calls epistemic collapse. When we say epistemic, we are talking about how a society knows what is true, how we agree on basic facts.
The shared reality.
The text suggests that shared institutions of truth, empirical science, objective journalism, university research, and democratic deliberation have collapsed under the weight of this system. Truth is withdrawn from the public, political sphere entirely.
Yes. In this rationality, truth is rolled over into two non-democratic domains. It is either reduced to a market metric, whatever gets the most clicks or generates the most profit is deemed true, or it is rolled over into moral and religious claims rooted in tradition and faith. And when truth is rooted purely in traditional faith or market metrics, it severs truth from democratic accountability entirely.
Because you can't argue with those.
As a citizen, you cannot debate a financial algorithm, and you cannot vote against a deeply held, privatized religious belief. The space for shared reality simply evaporates.
This raises an important question, perhaps the most critical question of our entire discussion. We have mapped the architecture. We have looked at the incentives, the weaponization of the courts, the predictable outcomes of inequality and resentment, and the feedback loops that keep it all running. So to you, the listener, we ask,
what is the crisis in perception here?
Exactly. What are we failing to see?
Let's break that down analytically, layer by layer, based on Wendy Brown's structural thesis. The first layer is what is being misperceived. Across the West, we're looking at this massive surge in anti-democratic politics, the rise of authoritarian populism, and the extreme bitter polarization of our societies.
We see it every day.
But we are misperceiving it as mere political extremism. We treat it as a temporary populist wave, a glitch in the matrix, or we attribute it entirely to the specific personalities of demagogic politicians.
We tell ourselves if we just vote this one guy out, or if we just get better people in office, the fever will break and things will go back to normal.
But that brings us to the second layer. What structural layer is actually obscured by that hopeful thinking?
What's hiding underneath?
What is obscured is that neoliberal rationality has fundamentally reorganized the DNA of democracy itself. This isn't a temporary glitch, it is the new operating system.
The system changed while we weren't looking.
The elevation of market logic above political equality and the intentional methodical erosion of the social have completely rewritten the rules of how power operates, how institutions function, and how citizens view themselves and each other.
Which explains the third layer, why surface interpretation fails. If you only look at the surface, you're confusing the symptoms with the disease.
Precisely.
The outrage on social media, the bitter culture wars about what is taught in schools, the hyperpolarization of our neighborhoods, these are not the root causes of our democratic decline. They are the predictable, mathematically manufactured symptoms of a system that actively produces precarity, deletes the language of shared fate, and incentivizes grievance to protect capital and traditional hierarchies.
And finally, the fourth layer. How systems analysis changes visibility. By doing what we have done today, by mapping out the incentive logic and the institutional pathways, like the weaponization of the courts by groups like the ADF, the privatization of social risk, and the dethroning of politics into pure management, we can clearly see that this brand of anti-democratic politics is not an accident.
It's not a mistake.
It is purposefully manufactured by the architecture of the system itself. Once you see the structural blueprint, the absolute chaos in a daily news cycle suddenly makes perfect, terrifying sense. It is the machine functioning exactly as designed.
It is a profound paradigm shift. And as we wrap up this deep dive into Wendy Brown's structural analysis, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week.
Think about the architecture we just mapped.
How often do you experience interactions in your daily life? From the algorithmic feeds that curate your reality on digital platforms, to the tiered VIP way you access healthcare or travel, to the way you manage your own personal brand where you simply accept market optimization and stratification as completely natural.
Where you don't even question it.
How often do you accept that logic without realizing it has quietly, methodically replaced your power to demand democratic equality?
It is the water we swim in, and seeing the water is the first step to understanding the currents that are pulling us.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter, visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.